how should we think about pricing as it relates to these services?
Yeah.
Because I think that is a very important signal. And, at the end, like, yeah, pricing is what reveals what you really sell.
Yeah. And pricing is a deep topic we can probably do a full podcast on. But yeah, just thinking about a few rough models. So one is called execution pricing, where you're really selling hours or tasks, so specific deliverables. Um, One is expertise pricing, where you're selling outcomes and value. And the third is transformation pricing, where you're pricing the business impact. So I think really just thinking through that, and for a lot of our agencies too, it really depends on what you're selling. But oftentimes you're pricing on expertise. Um, you think you're pricing on expertise and outcomes, but often you're actually selling execution, right? If your proposal has hours or deliverables as line items, like that's really execution.
Yeah, I mean, let's the thing about execution is, yeah, it's very like tangible in some ways, right? For the client to be like, okay, like you guys say you're going to do this and it costs this, it's going to take this much time, which translates to this much price. But what if what if we just kind of not do that? And then, there's like negotiation in the pricing that can happen. And, clients can nitpick on that and they could be like, hey, like, does that particular task need to take that much time? So, there's a lot of
Yeah.
that could go on with pricing. And, there's pros and cons to that. So I think, like for example, one of our, so Vaulted Oak, we talked about before, they're very much all about, execution pricing because they just sell buckets of hours and, they've stuck to that. They have hourly rates that kind of scale with, the number of hours that clients buy. So the more hours you buy, the lower the hourly cost. And, so they're trying to incentivize, kind of larger, bucket of hours purchases. And really, I think, the interesting thing here is like, if you manage that correctly, it's fine. And there is a degree of expertise that is required even in that execution, because if you sell hours, but in the client's mind, you're just taking too long and you're being like, it feels like you're being inefficient with those hours, they're going to feel like they're not getting value. And so, that's going to increase the risk of churn. So, you want to balance like the hours with like, the know-how. And then you want to be
Yeah.
like, all right, like this problem, of course, we've seen it before. We're going to do it quickly. And then, show the client a lot of value in the hours that they bought. So, you have to kind of balance the two of those things. And I think, the moment that gets out of whack, you're kind of at risk. And, just going down the line of like other pricing methods, there's obviously the fixed price, fixed scope method, right? And, this is kind of the standard of like, if you're selling like a website design project, 50K, and, it's all inclusive of the scope, or you're selling like a brand sprint, everything's inclusive of that. Clients tend to like that because there's, a cap on what they're spending. And then, they know exactly what they're getting. And then, they're able to commit to a budget before, they begin. But then, there's on the agency side, they have to assume some of that risk. And then, of course, there could be, if you wrote the scope a little bit loosely, there might be some disagreements on, what's in scope, outside of scope. So there could be change orders and other kind of fallout that happens there. So anyway, that's another method. And, it goes on and on. I mean, like the other thing that we commonly see is like this complexity-based pricing stuff where, pricing is tied to the variables, that make it the work harder, because of, maybe there's more, kind of employees or, business model complexity or like different number of locations that you have to take into account that like makes the work harder. And so with that, you price it on a per whatever basis. And so they're like, you can go into a lot of different aspects of this, but ultimately, like you want to be very strategic about picking the one that maps the best to your service offering so that for the client, it's very clear.
Yeah. And I think that's the thing about pricing is it doesn't need to be one or the other, right? It could be a combination. So let's say your core offer could be a fixed price, you're pricing it based on the value or the business impact, right? That's kind of one area. But then let's say you have an additional service where you're doing photos and you're doing that as a deliverable base. All right, for every photo or every product, here's the price. So it's a combination of that, fixed or the deliverable based versus the value based pricing. But as long as it's clear to the client and they know, all right, here are the things that if the scope goes up, price goes up, for example, and there's correlation, and it doesn't feel arbitrary where it's like, all right, like why is this price this way and this price that way, and there's some confusion there. I think that's the yeah, if there's the confusion, that's the entry point for negotiation, where it's like, all right, like can we
Yeah.
drop the price here, and can we do it a different way?
No, and I think, to your point, like it's fine to have different pricing methodology for the different services, but then if you have different ways of pricing the same thing. So
Yeah.
for example, if you have a core offer, but then you talk about it in terms of hours, and at the same time, there's a fixed fee component to it, but then you talk about some kind of outcome based thing. And, like, first of all, that's going to cause massive confusion for the client. But then the other time they're going to use that against each other to be like, yeah, well, like you said this for the outcome thing, but then, it's only taking this much time to execute it, like, and they're going to try to correlate those things. And so I think it's really important to, for on a per service basis to kind of like stick to that methodology.